So Darwin is used both to justify empire and to critique empire, and to justify capitalism and to critique capitalism. So it's a great, right, story about not only do science and politics go together, they go together in different ways and in ways that conflict with each other in some ways. So that's when things get really fun. The title of my course is Science, Culture, Power. Between science and power, those things that were supposed to be separate, even though they would get mixed up in these kinds of everyday saying sorts of ways, like knowledge is power. Well, wait, I thought they were kind of separate, but now you're saying they're the same, um, but they do have that very um, cultural notion of what counts as true. It are those things that you can show, well, if this line intersects this line at that, then we know for sure that this is 90 degrees. That becomes the kind of model for all of truth.
Greetings, friend, and welcome to Our World Openly with Antony Kalkowski. Today, we have a riveting podcast conversation with Professor Mike Fortun. Academically, Professor Fortun understands himself as a historian and anthropologist of the life sciences, genetics, and genomics in particular. Fortun studied physics as an undergraduate at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, one of the oldest polytechnic institutes in the US, until he transferred to Hampshire College and switched to philosophy of science. He worked in Washington, D.C. at the Institute for Policy Studies for a good chunk of the 80s before completing a PhD in the history of science in 1993 at Harvard University. For almost 20 years, he was in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer before coming to the Department of Anthropology at UC Irvine in 2017. He is the author of several books, including Muddling Through, Pursuing Science and Truths in the 21st Century, co-authored with physicist Herbert J. Bernstein, and the book Promising Genomics, Iceland, and deCODE Genetics in a World of Speculation. And most recently, Genomics With Care, Minding the Double Binds of Science, just published by Duke University Press. In the podcast, we talk about the general intersections of science, culture, and power, loving and hating science simultaneously, and the need for that paradoxical relationship, the science, culture, and power in the Manhattan Project and genocidal weapons, the intersections of the science with military and empire, the importance of who funds science, and therefore what scientific truths get researched, the history of Darwinian evolution, intelligent design as political agenda, how politics and science are made to be seen as separate but are not, feminist scientists, benefits of diversity within scientific collectives, the reason to be pro science, and the philosophical arguments for trusting sciences, even if their truths are often nebulous, ideologies of truth and purity in Greek history and in certain strands of the modern physicist and mathematical disciplines, and much, much more. The first 30 minutes, we discuss Fortun's fascinating academic and life history, and then dive straight into the depths of science, culture, and power. Now, I bring you Professor Mike Fortun. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this podcast. I am with an exciting guest. This is Professor Fortun. We have had a class actually together here at UC Irvine, which was absolutely amazing and fantastic. I loved it. It was about science, power, and culture, and the way that those three domains intersect, and all the ways in which we can see those intersections play out in our daily lives. Um, and so, Mike, tell me, please, what kind of drew you into the profession that you are skilled at, what kind of histories brought you to where you are, and why did you devote your life to becoming a historian of science and anthropologist?
Yeah, well, some, maybe all of those questions are unanswerable, but I can at least make a stab. So in class, I told one story, and I do like telling stories,
Mm,
which is a commonality that both historians and anthropologists share. Um, but I told the story of being a kid and having, well, two things that I spent hours just like laying on the floor reading. One was the World Book Encyclopedia, right? Uh, and to be exact, the 1958 World Book Encyclopedia, which, I think a lot of families in the, this is the 60s for me, had those, and there were like encyclopedia salesmen, always men, who went around selling encyclopedias. So you would have the encyclopedia in your house. Um, and I particularly like the S volume because of snakes and stars. And then the other big book that I had, and this is the story that I told, was Astronomy by Fred Hoyle, who's a big name or was a big name astronomer to the extent that astronomers have big names. And it was a big book. It was beautiful, had these beautiful photographs. Of course, nowhere near as beautiful photographs as we get now,
mm,
but still, it satisfied something in me and kind of got me hooked on um, imagining myself as being a scientist. And I think I always had that somehow, or at least in the back of my head. I was a nerd generally, but especially about science. And so I knew uh, when when I went to college. So I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and that name will come up throughout some of these stories because I wanted to be a physics major. I wanted to be an
mm,
astrophysicist. And to be an astrophysicist, you first had to be a physicist. So, and to be a physicist, you first had to get a bachelor's degree in physics. So that's how I kind of started out. And I mean, and this would be a way too long of a story, although I like long, shaggy dog stories. And those are like the only kinds of novels that I like to read. But we're trying to keep this not too shaggy. Um, so over the course of being at Rensselaer as a physics major, I began realizing that one, man, it was going to be a long slog to be to get a PhD in physics.
mm,
And like in my sophomore year, I was already starting to feel like, and I was in honors physics, I was doing okay, but it was getting to the point where it's just like, this is going to take a real math chops. And I'm not sure that I got those real math chops. And I'm not sure I'm interested in finding out or if I need to develop them or not. And I also realized that if I didn't go on to get a PhD, I would end up like working at General Electric or Westinghouse or places that had, need for bachelor's physics degree holders. And at the same time, I started getting more interested in the history and philosophy of science. And that was, and how I think that was always kind of there too. Um, my dad was a high school English teacher, and so uh, I had a lot of exposures to that. That was also part of my nerddom. I helped him grade his Greek mythology papers, um, and so becoming more and more interested in the history and philosophy of physics and realizing that I couldn't really do that by and like further explore those by staying at RPI just because there just weren't any there was no history department.
Mm.
There was no philosophy department. There were historians and philosophers there, and I eventually came back to be one of them. But the humanities and social sciences at RPI were almost non or very minimal in existence. They've gotten better since then, but at the time, which was in the 1970s, there just was not a way for me to do that. So I was actually going to drop out of school for a while, and I was going to join the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. I was still a good Catholic boy. Um, but instead, somebody said, you should really look at this other school, Hampshire College, where there's no grades. You devise your own curriculum. You take courses that you want to take or don't take courses at all. And you basically like make up your own major. And so that's what I did. So I transferred to Hampshire College, which is in Amherst, Massachusetts, and is in the news recently because they just offered automatic transfer to students from New College, Florida, the one that Ron DeSantis has kind of taken over, and the right has taken over. And it was this like experimental hippie school, which is what Hampshire College was. And there's very few of those now, almost none. And so now that it looks like New College is going to go completely the Hillsdale College route, for people who know that reference. Hampshire said any student who wants to come to Hampshire, will make the transfer as easy as possible. We'll get you started. You can do all of the things that you wanted to do and continue it here. So anyway, Hampshire was that kind of school, and it was a great experience for me. And so then I started reading just a lot more philosophy and a lot of history of science too. And it's when when I transferred, I was assigned there were two physicists there, and one of them was Herb Bernstein, who came to our class because he happened to be coming through town. So he became really my like prime teacher. And through but so I I had those interests in science, in stories about science, in the philosophy of science. But still, when I graduated from Hampshire, which was in January of 1982, um, I I didn't know. Well, one, I didn't even entertain the possibility of graduate school. It was just like not in my imagination. So I went to work for Ralph Nader, which is maybe a fading name now. Yeah, and I see on the look on your eyes,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, it's totally faded. He was the consumer advocate. He started like the PIRGs, the public interest research groups. That there's like CalPIRG and MassPIRG. He wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, which was about the Ford Pinto that would blow up if you got rear-ended the right way, the way the gas tank was arranged. Anyway, he did all of that kind of stuff. I worked for him briefly, and then I worked in Washington D.C. I'll try I'll try to be less shaggy and get up to the back to the science part of it. Unless you're happy with these really shaggy stories.
I'm happy. I'm
Okay,
happy with the stories.
Um, and so I worked in DC. I came out to the West Coast for a while. I worked in San Francisco as for a temp agency, and I eventually became their receptionist because I'm a very good receptionist. And then I went back to DC, and I had like sort of odd jobs, not like painting houses and fixing things, odd jobs, but like I read, and this was actually the best job I have ever had in my life. was I worked for the National Endowment for the Arts, which at the time was in the post office building, which eventually became Trump Hotel, right across from not the Treasury, but you might have a kind of visual imagination for what that building looks like. Great building to work in. My job, which was it was just a 3-month job, but I had to pack up. They had 100 books from small independent presses of poetry, short stories, mostly poetry and short stories, some nonfictions and some longer fiction, but mostly like edited anthologies. And they would take those books to the Frankfurt Book Fair and the Buenos Aires Book Fair and try to sell the foreign rights to these small press books as a way, because the major publishers would do that themselves and they go to these book fairs to sell, translation rights or whatever. But the smaller presses had no way to kind of foot that bill. So the National Endowment for the Arts took them as as part of their like government service. So my job was to write up all of a little paragraph blurb on what the book was about, and then outline what rights were available and do all this stuff. And so make this catalog, which meant I had to read all the books. So I sat in the office and I'm like reading poetry and I'm reading short stories and then I'm writing like a quick summary and then packed them up and shipped them off to these 2 book fairs along with the catalog of rights information. It was a great job. And that was right before I went back to graduate school or went to graduate school. There's no back to it. Back to school, but in graduate school. And that too was this kind of like, not to my credit, I don't think, but I've never really been ambitious and had like a master plan or even a master plan B. It was all just sort of kind of like stuff just seemed to happen. So really, I was had these like jobs like reading poetry and some other things, and I was like, I need health care, and I need to be doing something else. So, and then somebody said, well, you should go to graduate school, and you can go to graduate school in the history of science at Harvard, which is what I did, right? And so I don't like to mention the Harvard part, as you know, because I'm from a small town in Western Pennsylvania, and Harvard. This is that class thing that we were talking about before we started the recording, and Harvard just was not in my class, and so I didn't. It was hard for me to imagine myself there. It's still hard for me to like acknowledge or say that, yeah, I have a PhD in the history of science from Harvard University. But so that early interest, that little boy laying on the floor looking at pictures of stars, carried through with this profound both fascination for and love of science, but also a kind of growing consciousness about all of the things that are wrong with it and have been wrong with it, both in how it's often been used, whether it's to build weapons of mass destruction, um, or pesticides that eventually come back and start poisoning the people who were trying to just poison the insects. Um, so those kinds of stories in which science becomes clear that it's sort of the promise of full enlightenment, unending progress, unerring progress, um, clearly needed to be rethought. Um, and so, and I guess I've always tried to figure out how those 2 things can go together, how you can both love, and it really is like a love hate thing.
Mhm.
And so, but at the same time, you realize it's like, well, we have love hate relationships all the time, and it's sometimes kind of weird, but generally we make it work.
Mhm.
So how can I both love science and hate it? And how can I get other people to love and hate science, both for the right reasons, and also to just better appreciate what a kind of crazily human thing science and the doing of it is. Right? And so all of the things that I've written, and I've thought about, I should try to write a memoir or a novel, and lots of people in academia, especially when they're like trying to get out, start exploring other genres. Um, but I've never done that. I've only written about science. I feel like I'm at my best in writing about science, and maybe I just haven't given the other stuff enough of a shot. But it's also having taught about it now for 20 plus years. It's even more kind of part of my identity that that's what I do. I try to and I try to sort of perform it out in large part through telling stories that um and so it's not just about an information transfer, but it's about like I want to show you how and why I love and hate science, and that way I think maybe students come to love and hate it for the same reasons, which I hope are the right reasons. So that's the long, or I don't know if that's, and certainly not the end of the story, but that's the short version of the long story about how I came to be where I am. So I'll just kind of keep finishing it to get me here to this couch. So after I got my PhD, I again, because I don't have that big ambition drive in me, I spent a lot of time trying to stay out of academia,
Mm.
in part because I didn't want to write that way, the way
Mm.
that academics write. And
In a kind of like more class-based writing, more technical. Like, could you expand on that just a
what's
tiny
this?
bit?
Yeah, not fun. I mean, if there's one word for summarizing what most academic writing is, it's not fun.
Mhm.
And I don't understand that. It's like, uh, and I shouldn't say that entirely because I have a lot of fun reading stuff. So it's not just academic writing, but a certain kind of disciplinary academic writing that I just wasn't interested in doing. So I helped start a nonprofit organization around science called the Institute for Science and Interdisciplinary Studies with my former teacher and now colleague and becoming co-author, Herb Bernstein. Um, and I taught like a course at MIT to just like bring money in. And I taught a course back at Hampshire College. And then I also in this process met Kim eventually Fortune, who at the time was Kim Laughlin. And she was teaching at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute,
Mm.
which is where I had escaped from. Um, and she was in a science and technology studies department. And for a lot of reasons, I said, yeah, no way am I ever going near that department. And I do not want that job. But then things kind of changed in a microwave, in a micro kind of way. And they had a job open up that was kind of perfect for me. They wanted somebody doing like biomedical anthropology of biomedicine, that kind of thing. And so I fit and I applied and I got that job. So then for the next 19 years, both Kim and I taught in the Science and Technology Studies department, which was an interdisciplinary department. There was uh, Kim as an anthropologist. There were actually a couple of other anthropologists of science. There was me as a historian at the time. Well, and a political scientist, a couple of sociologists. So it was this kind of mix of people. And that's the great thing about that field is that it has these multiple perspectives in it. Um, and so after 19 years, we moved to UC Irvine, uh, in part because Kim became chair of the anthropology department here. And this was the first time that she had been, and her degree is actually in anthropology, but it was the first time she was in an actual anthropology department. And she missed a lot of things about anthropology, and a lot of things she didn't miss, but there were a lot of things that she did. So it was a great opportunity for her. Um, they welcomed me because I've always practiced, even though officially I'm a historian of science. I've always been in the contemporary era when I'm doing my research and what I'm interested in, which is mostly genetics and genomics and biotech, bio anything. Um, so I've been in an anthropology department now, and I have a love-hate relationship with that discipline too. But I've actually been able to make that I think work because uh, mostly I play on the love of anthropology, even though, and in part because I'm not one, I get to sort of overlook the worst or just I don't have to deal with it, and I can just like anthropology is great. So here I am in an anthropology department, and trying to kind of adapt what were really history of science courses into an anthropology frame. So it's why I still have in all of my classes, there's usually a week or two, and then kind of threaded throughout of specifically historical readings and materials and topics, just because I think they're important, whether it's the history of the Manhattan Project or the history of Darwin and evolutionary theory. Great story. I miss telling those stories. In my other class, I do Galileo because I miss telling the Galileo story. It's such an awesome, it's such a great story. And he's such the iconic uh, scientist and still is referred to as like, as the guy who stood up to power, right?
Mhm.
And established the independence and ultimately superior power of science. Um, uh, but the story is just way more complicated than that, and maybe we'll have I don't know if I could tell it in a 3-minute version. I can do it in 90 minutes, I know that. Um, but so anyway, even though I'm in an anthropology department, I still use these historical materials to get people to think because a lot of things about science haven't changed, and the cultural relations that it has with the broader world that it's always being done within. Those are kinds of structures and patterns that repeat and persist and still raise the kinds of questions about, what's the responsibility of the scientist? Uh, what does it mean to tell the truth?
Yeah.
And how do you get to the point where you are confident enough to know that you have the truth to tell? So,
Yeah, no, those are great questions that I'd actually want to pick your brain on. But
okay.
your story is just it's so fascinating and like it almost kind of reflects this your love-hate relationship with science itself, going from these science institutions then away into the
And then I got to go
humanities.
back again.
Yeah, exactly. It's this really interesting dynamic. But maybe it might be helpful to start with then this kind of you mentioned Galileo, right? And this kind of idea of a superior method of truth finding, kind of science. So,
Mhm.
if you could maybe speak on the our kind of cultural, our dominantly cultural notions of science being this very kind of objective, somehow extracted from the human container, which only produces, yes or no answers. And especially like you get you have this like purity scale that you mentioned in class of, from the
Yeah.
physicists to the, all the way to the, physicists, biologists, then into the humanities. And oh, the physicists are more true than the, uh, the anthropologists. Um, so if you could just kind of frame for us how science is not really this objective container, and how the human and the institutional and all of these other domains kind of go into it. And of course, you might, because it's a very broad kind of question, it might be helpful if you can frame this through giving us another story, let's say the Manhattan Project, and how you can see literally within history the ways in which the human informs and the institutional informs the way that truth is made, and how science itself is fueled by those more uh, subjective quote unquote elements.
Um, yeah. Well, um, I'm not sure that the Manhattan Project will get us into the subjective elements, although they can kind of be there. But it is the one of the things that, as a historian of science, we kind of learn it as this is, and one of the courses I used to teach was called The Cultures of Scientific Revolutions.
Mm,
So it was I did Galileo and the scientific revolution, which by the way took like 200 years and played out very differently in different places. So there was more than one scientific revolution, and it was a really slow revolution as far as revolutions go. Um, so I did Galileo, I did Darwin and evolutionary theory, and then bringing it up to like the Scopes trial, and still attempts to get intelligent design taught in public schools here. And then the Manhattan Project, and then the Watson and Crick and the molecular biology revolution. So I did a course called The Cultures of Scientific Revolutions, but the Manhattan Project was one in which we were told how, in all of those other ones, the kind of social worlds of science were relatively stable, or at least kind of changing slowly. Manhattan Project was just this like immediate,
mm,
real revolutionary changes in how physics was done, at least. And then, by extension, a lot of other sciences, although that took longer to go around. But immediately, one, physics became militarized in a more concentrated and obvious form than it had been. I mean, the military has always needed physics and engineers to like go about its business of killing people um, and taking territory for capital.
mm,
Uh, but so the Manhattan Project, and this is, I mean, at least we know that there were a number of scientists who, and so like Herb, my colleague and teacher, his dad was recruited to work on the Manhattan Project, and the recruiter said, "We want you to come and join this wartime project. We can't tell you what it's about."
mm,
Right? And Herb's dad was like, "No, I don't do that. Right? If I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not doing it."
yeah.
Right? So that kind of, and Herb thinks of it as a moral sensibility. And that's a good way to think about it. It's just like, I'm not going to work. I'm not going to work on those kinds of projects. A lot of physicists felt that way before. And, so the example of Robert Oppenheimer, who becomes the lead scientist and really the leader of at least the scientific part of the Manhattan Project, the scientific and engineering part of it. Um, he was a left-wing commie radical Sanskrit reading, intellectual. And the his colleague says, the last person we ever thought would like lead up something like the Manhattan Project would have been Robert Oppenheimer. And yet he does. And he carries it off brilliantly and successfully. But then, and then again later in his life comes to have some sorts of, moral regrets. And there were many comments that he kind of made along the way about, the physicists have known sin, which, pissed a lot of other physicists off. It's like, hey, speak for yourself, buddy. I don't feel like I've done any sinning. I'm doing my patriotic duty.
Mm.
So, but I love, right, you can tell, I love those kinds of complexities and those stories, and the fact that, yeah, there are different ways to put physics and morality and politics together. And so, how do we? But the way to, begin try to putting them together better, and let's just define better as fewer people getting killed, right? At least kind of starts by understanding those differences and the fact that they exist and they very much influence the way science gets done, what science gets done, and so on and so on. So the Manhattan Project is a great story for that, about how the federal government really comes into managing science and really kind of setting the agenda for science through a funding structure that comes through universities like this and goes into the sciences from the federal government. Um, After World War II, that kind of huge social machinery just quickly gets established in place, and just a new way of doing physics and other forms of science in in a way that it hadn't been done before. And scientists becoming, in the case of the physicists first, kind of high level advisors to governments. So the physicists for, well, what new kinds of weapons should we develop? And, we touched on in the class the example of moving from the first successful atomic weapons to the question of whether you would develop thermonuclear weapons or the hydrogen bomb or the super, as it was called. And language is always one of the great things to track here. And we saw how, all of those scientists who had advised on how to build the bombs, the atomic bombs, where to drop them, on which cities, how do you study all of that? They were the advisors for that. They continued to be the advisors. And then when they're asked, should we build hydrogen bombs if it's possible? And that was a complicating factor, but assuming if it is possible, should we do it? And they all uniformly said no, right? Like everyone, everybody on that advisory committee said no. And some of them said, hell no. It's a genocidal weapon. It's an evil thing. And again, that's the direct quote. It's an evil thing in any light. It's like, you can't really be more explicit than that.
Mhm.
And at that point, the government basically, well, it doesn't actually say this, but it effectively says, yeah, go pound sand. We didn't really want your advice anyway. We're building this. And so now here we are, 27,000 nukes later. Um, over the advice of the scientists. So scientists begin to move into these worlds in which they were supposed to, right, remain, if not like separate from, at least kind of safely contained in a way that they weren't infected, or their purity, right? Another one of those words that means so many things. Um, their purity was always the most important thing to maintain. So you could give them money, but you can't expect anything directly for that money, kind of thing. You can ask for their advice, but they can't tell you what to do. There was always these kinds of compartmentalizations that happened, but they were changing, and in part they're changing because there are a number of outspoken people who begin changing them, and outspoken scientists. So the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty in 1962 comes about in large part because Linus Pauling, Nobel laureate and chemist, really begins trying to organize the scientific community and other kind of organizations too, to say we got to stop. As long as we're going to continue testing nukes, we should like not test them on Pacific islands where they will obliterate places and infect the people who, not in fact, but radiate the people who live there as a consequence of the tests that got bigger than we imagined that they would. And all of the people who live downwind, which is pretty much everybody in the United States, of the atomic testing that's going on in Nevada. So there the scientists say, you should really like rethink this because not good. And they do, right? It doesn't solve the nuclear problem, but it was at least the right thing to do at the time. But you had the kind of larger point of you have these scientists who start to realize that's like they can't just um, absent themselves or absolve themselves from the political and cultural and social effects of the work that it is that they're doing. Um, so Rachel Carson being the other, kind of famous example of scientists developing a real public persona. And that's why I'm always interested in those few scientists who kind of, although growing in numbers, who rise to that level of public persona in a way that even Oppenheimer was never really a household name, at least not in the way that Einstein was, right? So an Einstein, a Rachel Carson, a Carl Sagan, um, these people became the kind of figureheads of being the scientist in America. And I'm woefully kind of parochial in my focus on the United States because that's what I learned how to do in graduate school. A lot of other people, but they worked on German science or British science or French science. There was never, or very rarely, and only until recently, that there was study of scientific traditions in other places. There's always something on China, a big thing on uh, Islamic science. So when I was in history of science, again in graduate school, one of the courses that we were required to take was in the history of Islamic science, which is, during the European Dark Ages, it's where real intellectual stuff is happening, while in mathematics and in optics and all of that. Um, so how did I get from Carl Sagan to Islamic science? I'm not sure, but that these figures of who a scientist is and why they should be listened to and how they're listened to. I'm I find that really important and interesting, and something to try to teach about too.
Yeah, you have this kind of like um, celebrity status being conferred onto some of these sciences you mentioned, Einstein and Carl Sagan. It's so interesting that they're all,
Well,
physicists.
yeah,
But again, like you had
but
Oppenheimer, who was a physicist, but maybe his, leftist leanings kind of made people a bit more hesitant to make him a cultural celebrity. With you mentioned like the Islamic kind of sciences and also you know the sciences that come out in history just kind of like floated in my head. There's a lot of, I guess, science really kind of flourishes historically within empire almost, it seems, because you have the
oh,
Islamic empire, you have the British empire, which through colonialism was able, and this is another kind of discussion where this, in order to do science you need obviously the resources, the materials, and so for the British to uh, do their specific sciences and create their specific technologies, they need to extract uh, resources and value and labor from other continents. With the Islamic Empire, I mean, it's also you're spreading through and conquering territories, giving you not only resources but also intellectual labor. Um, and with the U.S., like I mean, the U.S. is for all intents and purposes a form of empire, I think.
yeah,
And I think, we are maybe so science focused for one reason. Of course, we have a military that is fueled, and that empire sustained by a military that is fueled by science and technology. But also we have the affordance, we have the ability, the US has the ability to produce that kind of science and to monopolize what gets funded, and what kind of truths come out. You talk about the Manhattan
yeah,
Project, right? It's really interesting how you have the what a thousands of scientists, including physicists and so chemists going on, how all of their their minds and their intellectual focus and labor went to precisely what the US military wanted them to do, which was create a weapon of mass destruction that now poses an existential risk to all of humanity and all of the other animals on the planet.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, all true. And don't let me forget to get back to the empire question, because of course I thought of a number of stories there. But at the same time, I think it's important to say that, and now the historian in me comes out. It's like, yeah, that seems like that to us now. That narrative makes total sense and is a really compelling argument. In 1944, you have a lot of Jewish emigres from Europe. So the idea that you were like, they really thought, and I think genuinely believed that, and even the most kind of uh, anti-empire people among them um, were like, we got to do anything, we got to do everything we can to keep the National Socialist Germany from expanding any further. And if that means building this kind of weapon. And so they didn't, it wasn't like so intentional of just
Mhm.
like, yes, world domination.
Yeah.
I mean, not entirely anyway, or not uniformly. But absolutely, that kind of very tight linkage between, well, so the title of my course is Science, Culture, Power. Between science and power, those things that were supposed to be separate, even though they would get mixed up in these kinds of everyday saying sorts of ways, like knowledge is power. Well, wait, I thought they were kind of separate, but now you're saying they're the same, or um, but those connections were always there, and there was this codependency from the beginning, and you can go back as far as you want. The whole thing only starts really happening, and it happens really in Europe at scale, as we would say today, is because of the wealth that was extracted from the New World in the century before the 1600s and the 1700s, which made European societies wealthy in a way that they hadn't been, which allowed them to support this new kind of class of scientists who were their utility to the state and to empire was becoming more and more obvious, even if they were also interested in a lot of things that didn't seem to have that kind of apparent utility. Right? Um, that relationship was always there. I don't use this example in in this class that you were in, but in another class, I show the charter for the Royal Society in England in 1667 or something like that, after the English Civil Wars, which basically and so now you have the restored king, and the scientists were kind of like being very careful during the Civil War about like not wanting to get bad with the Oliver Cromwell faction, but still wanting to keep their options open with the royalty, getting them back in. And so the royalty comes back in, and they establish the Royal Society, right? Which says, you scientists have license to do whatever you want, as long as it doesn't meddle in metaphysics, morals, something, and there's a long list of things that, and so you have this contract that's like, stay out of politics, right? But that contract was enforced or set in place by this political entity. So the no politics contract was dependent on a political contract. So those kinds of contradictions, I think, are also really interesting. But so the empire story that I thought of, which you know, so here Darwin is the exemplar, and so before Einstein was the kind of global phenomena of the scientist, it would have been Darwin, of having that same sort of recognition and fame, such as it was. I mean, but it actually, at least in England, it becomes a thing in part because while Darwin is doing his work, you have this enormous popular interest, in part because now you have a middle class that kind of has the leisure to read things in a new way. And so they become interested in science. And it's like, oh, they're discovering these fossils. And oh, there's this, controversy over how old the Earth is. Is it 6,000 years ago? As we are sure it is, because that's what the Bible tells us it is, or is it longer, right? And so you had the first kind of popular interest or popular culture interest in science and reading about it. And so you had people writing for the masses. And so that was all kind of very much sort of setting the stage for Darwin, who didn't want to have really anything to do with it, right? At one level, even though he's a brilliant writer, right? Wrote better than Einstein ever did, for sure, widely read, um, um, but very reluctant to engage with the politics of evolution as it, first started playing out there. But the contradiction or the twist there is that even as Darwin is dependent on, and then in turn, the empire needs Darwin to justify what it's been doing. It's just like, look, the British, as we can tell from Darwin, has survived because they're the fittest, and we deserve to be in the ruling position here because have you had a look at all those other people out there that are these funny colors and or different colors and wear these funny things? They can't run an empire. But right. So the empire needed that Darwinian argument. But at the same time, what Darwin also does, and this as part of that larger movement, is what's happening in England is that the sciences and engineering become the way to both for somebody to ascend in their class order. So anybody could become a scientist,
Mm.
right? And you didn't have to be royalty. Darwin is called, the last of the gentleman scientists. He doesn't have funding. He has his allowance from his father. Um, so he never has a official position. But now official positions are becoming right a thing, whether it's running museums or on expeditions, or there's an opportunity for this new class of or new part of the middle class, which are these technical experts, right? And their authority depends not on you know, uh, being a member of the landed gentry and the nobility, which has this connection to God, but their authority comes from we know how to produce the truth that everybody has to agree to. So both the the development of empire, but also the kind of slow not eating away from within, but the change from within that is more democratizing, to just put it that way, than the empire would allow for. So there's more movement in part through the sciences now, class movement, but also movement of power from the House of Lords to the House of Commons,
Mm.
that way. Um, but it's still an empire.
Yeah.
So, but all of those things are going on.
That immediately I think of I guess maybe how, truth itself and the ability to produce truth, whether it's, valid under certain methods or not, creates a ability to exert power. And so when you had Darwin, there was of course these very contentious battles within the truth that the church would present individuals and the truth that Darwin would claim through his, the scientific methods that you would utilize. And it's interesting how, I guess, as you're talking about this shift of scientists coming out from the middle classes and kind of going into and gaining this more social role, uh, that it kind of it's like it's like a replacement of the religious truth, right?
Mhm.
Creating a power. And so, in a lot of ways, you can think of the struggle for, you know, to of whether evolution is true or not, and the struggle of whether things or theories are true or not as struggles of power, and who are the individuals that would lose power if a certain truth would come
Right.
about, and which ones would gain from it is an interesting analytical tool, I think, to look at a lot of the things that we see in science in our daily lives. And um, when we're talking about, like, also going back to empire, that kind of does remind me of the way in which in our class we were learning about the discovery of DNA, and how a lot of the ways in which the technology itself that was used to investigate the structure of DNA was developed and used in looking at
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
microstructures of certain resources. And if I recall, it was as well, it was cotton,
Coal and cotton were the two big
coal,
ones.
and
Yeah.
cotton, which is obviously like, what
Yeah.
the British Empire
Yeah.
is famous for and where it gets its
And
wealth from.
tea
And
and
tea
sugar.
and sugar. Um, so that's
Yeah.
this whole fascinating thing. But to kind of slightly, I guess, alternate directions, or go into another mode. Well, I guess it's still related. Um, I guess is, how do you see these competitive dynamics within sciences, or cooperative dynamics within sciences, inform what is produced as truth, and how ideology itself, notions of possibly dominance, and especially under a kind of masculine dominance, how that informs what science, scientists produce. I'm harkening back, of course, to slime molds and things like that, and so it's two. I guess it's two questions. One is, the things you presented with the slime molds and the feminist science, but also the ways in which science has this competitive and almost, this new competitive taste, or within it, that I would argue stems from a culture of capitalism.
Uh, yes. Yes, and uh, there's, I think, more to it at the same time. So, what there's a lot going on there,
Mhm,
and but part of the reason there's a lot going on there is that there's a lot going on, and we expect um, these big things, these big words like science, or for that matter, religion or empire, to be like um, stable, definable, nameable, mostly regular, identifiable things. Right?
mhm,
And relatively uniforms. Like, well, that's science. That's the science circle in the Venn diagram, and here's the religion circle in the Venn diagram, and we kind of know which one goes where, and there's a lot of overlap. So first of all, there's all that differentiation within the sciences that it is part of how change is going to happen, but also part of its own sort of um, not authorization, but I mean, science does have this by building uh, skepticism in at a fundamental level, at a methodological level, at least again in theory, right? It does have that kind of destabilizing force even within the uniformly uh, categorizable thing called sciences. But we know that within there, it's like, well, the physicists are the real scientists, and they're the only ones that really can tell you what's fundamentally true and solid, and right. And that's because they're really close to mathematics, and the closest to mathematics, and mathematics and geometry was the model for what definitive knowledge and truth was all about. And that was there since the Greeks. So that's pre-capitalist,
mm,
right? But they do have that very um, cultural notion of what counts as true. It are those things that you can show. Well, if this line intersects this line at that, then we know for sure that this is 90 degrees. That becomes the kind of model for all of truth, it's like if you can start from these axioms, right? A straight line is this, perpendicular is this, all of those things that kind of go together, and then once you once you then move through all the layers of proof, right, you come to the only answer that you can possibly come to, which is that, the cosine of theta is 0.76, is the kind of model for how that becomes the model for how science is supposed to work and what science does. And that's in the scientist cultural imaginary of what they're doing. It's in the popular cultural imaginary of what scientists are doing. It's like they're working it out. They're like finding the exact, all of the axioms, everything, all the facts, lining it up all correctly. And then you get that QED, that which was to be demonstrated, answer. That's what science is that definitive, challengeable, right, statement of truth. But that, from a very narrow, well, that's good for geometry, right? Now, well, then that applies to physics, and that applies to biology, or before there was biology, it's natural history, which is a very different thing. So most of the science, most of what counts as science doesn't fit and never fit that kind of model of get everything nailed down and then you get the final answer. But it becomes part of the narrative that they tell themselves that they're doing, and that's part of their authority, and that's part of why they're different. It's like historians will always disagree about, what the causes of the 1917 Russian Revolution was, or the French Revolution. Oh my God, try to get agreement on that, right? But that's because they don't have the method, the scientific method, or they're not dealing with the same kind of phenomena we are, or they don't have the same kind of ideals. So that was a way to try to say that nothing, science, it's the idea of science is an idea, right? And the real world almost never matches up to the idea. And this is also something that, right, again, just to go back to the Greeks, they knew that as well too. So I think what I was trying to say was that yes to capitalism, but also all of this other stuff too, which, I think is important to keep in mind. And this is in part why science in non-capitalist contexts, of which there are precious few, right, becomes kind of becomes interesting in its own way. So most recently, and I don't really work on this, but there are many anthropologists to do of what has been called traditional knowledge, right? The fact that there are people who have deep knowledge of thousands of plants without having at least the same sorts of categorical schemes that we do, the same sorts of understandings of what a plant is, right? Nevertheless, have real knowledge about the natural world, and it's not just plants, but about the stars, right? All of that, astronomy is certainly pre-capitalist. Um, so, yeah, I think I was just complicating your story a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's I appreciate that. Yeah, I think when I think of, capitalism and science, I usually frame, again, like I tried to frame it as a culture of capitalism that maybe influences certain dynamics within science. So for example, you have a competitive a spirit, like with
Oh yeah,
with
that was yeah.
discovery of DNA and those kinds of things. But you seem very fired up to answer, so go ahead.
I know, no, because it was the competitive spirit part that really first got me going. And back to Darwin again. See, I really missed this, and so I'm going to have to figure out how to get Darwin back into this course because it is so great and so complicated at the same time. Because right, we know, right, historians know that. It takes a long time. It takes a while for Darwin to kind of put it all together, right? But one of the things that he puts together or brings into, his observations of finches in the Galapagos Island is his understanding of what is really the first kinds of works of political economy. And so it's Malthus on population and agriculture and growth and expansion and all of that. And the fact that, there are limited resources compared to the need that's there. And therefore, you have to compete for those limited resources. And so part of Darwin from the beginning was a not a justification, but very much based on an understanding of competition. It's natural. It's what humans do. And that's what it means to survive. And so those kinds of mutual justifications between early laissez-faire capitalism, right, and early evolutionary theory were really, I mean, Darwin's explicit in saying it was Malthus that really kind of made things click for me, right? And not just looking at finches and right, and putting and just thinking about the natural world. He's thinking about the social world. Um, so evolutionary theory becomes a way for the British Empire to justify itself to the world and for capitalism to rationalize itself as, yeah, well, maybe some of the effects aren't so great, and maybe some parts of government should do some things about that. And so that's the early welfare movements are start, but like not too much, or don't expect us to like be restraining our profits or doing anything like that, um, because we need to be free to compete because that's how the whole thing works. It works that way in the natural world. It works that way in the social political world. So be nice to have a different political economy, but that's just the way things are, right? We were born to be capitalists, to be crude about it, right? But at the same time that's going on, and at the same time that's going on, you also have the real radicals in Britain who are also huge fans of evolutionary theory, right? But for entirely different reasons, because it shows that yeah, no one was born to like be in charge of anything. We're all competing, and there's no reason why you folks should be in charge because you're no better than us. And we actually, by being more scientific and having greater knowledge than the people in power do, and certainly than the people running the church do, right? Get out of the way. So Darwin is used both to justify empire and to critique empire, and to justify capitalism and to critique capitalism. So it's a great, right, story about not only do science and politics go together, they go together in different ways and in ways that conflict with each other in some ways. So that's when things get really fun.
Yeah, no, the way in which science and what we
On the other hand, I'm 100% clear. It's like, do not be teaching intelligent design in public school science classes. Like, absolutely not. You you teach evolutionary theory because that is the truth.
Mm,
That is the scientific truth. there accept no substitutes. We're not even having this conversation unless like bring it to court and force it, because we're not going to do that, because that is religion.
Yes.
No, and I say I'm so kind of adamant about this because there was a sort of sociologist of science, Steve Fuller, who, and I don't mind saying this on tape, I was never a big fan of,
Mm.
right? And then he testified in the Kitzmiller trial, which was in Pennsylvania, which was the big intelligent design trial in, I don't know, uh, I'm a bad historian now that I've been an anthropologist for so long. Um, um, but he testified, right? So he gets up in court and says, as a science studies expert, I can tell you that, there's no such, basically, there's no such thing as science. It's all a story about, how we group things, like I just kind of gave you. It's no different than doing religion. And, you can't show me why intelligent design should not be taught alongside evolutionary theory from this, philosophical, social perspective, right? And he was an expert witness. And many others of us in the science studies community were absolutely horrified that he did this. It's like, it might be, it's certainly an argument that a number of the people in our field have made, that at least at some kind of academic level, we should consider everything equally, and people believe this for good reasons. But it was also completely tone deaf politically, and anybody who had any political sense at all knew that those guys don't give a shit about science. They just want prayer back in the school. And they're using evolutionary theory as the wedge to, right, to get onto the school board, or to force the issue, or to say, right. So,
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, scientists and the scientific community, like, and we've seen this throughout history, has been preyed upon specifically for this kind of also, I guess, a tendency to try to weigh all arguments within their framework and give the other side an ability to speak in this kind of democratic, I guess, more way. But we've seen with all the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry, and now this is a big discussion for that I put my focus on. But same thing with the meat industry. There's this huge push of kind of, oh, here are our scientists and our experts, and they're a good counterbalance to the whole collective of scientists. That this kind of, you're getting this notion of the individual heroic scientist coming to deliver the true truth, and they're battling this whole misinformed quote unquote mob mentality collective of scientists. But you in the class claim that one of the things that really gives truth produced by science, its truthiness, its its kind of substance, is specifically that it gets produced by this expert community that has done all this scientific work to uh, develop their arguments, to look at the evidence, and then that they have checks on themselves within this community. They have whole structures in which they validate their theories or not, based on rules, based on skepticism, based on peer review. And that's how you get some of these, this kind of uh, truth or approximating to the truth come out. And so it's very good that you're kind of reminding me to remind our audience that like we are
Yeah.
pro
Yeah.
science. It's not just two philosophizing individuals saying that,
Right.
oh, everything's relative, throw it all up in the air, because that gets preyed upon. And it's also not the way that reality works. Reality isn't. And I guess reality. It's a very also contentious term, but it's not like everything is just nebulous. It's
Yeah.
intersected and it's shifting and it's changing and it's mutating and all of those things.
Or even if it is nebulous, we actually have developed quite good knowledge about aerosols, right?
Yeah.
So we can analyze clouds. That's fine, right? So we don't, I think we think that or thought that we need these precise, clean, absolute definitions in order to think at all. And I think what I'm saying is like, no, no, we don't. Or, I mean, it's nice to have that sometimes, but it can also be misleading. And again, as you said, right, even scientists, but it's no different. So your description of why the scientists are able to arrive at some degree of truthiness, right, also applies to historians and to anthropologists. It's like we have peer review, we have structures where people come together and argue stuff out and have disagreements or agreements or work through the evidence, right? And we have evidence too. I mean, we're all engaged with collecting data and analyzing data. So those things that were supposed to differentiate science from other intellectual pursuits, those two don't fall into they're cloudier than they are, or at least in some places they're cloudier more than they are distinct. But we can still analyze the cloudiness. It just takes longer, and it also takes a different form. And part of the form that it takes is much more discursive than you know going down the list of axioms until you arrive at the QED numerical, right, proper value. Clouds just require narrative, and you're not going to get the kind of closure, or not always going to get the kind of closure and certainty that you might in other domains using other sciences. But that's kind of the way things are, and that doesn't make my form of knowledge somehow lesser than your form of knowledge. It means that we're producing different kinds of knowledge out of different kinds of expert communities with different kinds of criteria. And we shouldn't expect them to all kind of like converge onto the same method or even the same set of answers.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you have, it's funny you say this, the way in which you have science and then other academic or intellectual pursuits kind of overlapping. I do think that in a lot of ways, you could say that, oh, like they differ in maybe certain methods, but even within science, obviously, like, and I really want to get into this, the way in which the biologist, the geneticist, and then the epidemiologists, as both scientists, their methods are radically different and have radically different underpinnings, but in all other ways, like academia and intellectual categories, they fall into buckets of funding, right? I
Yeah.
think a lot of the categories are just produced by what gets funded and who, the priorities of the person that wants to fund certain productions of knowledge over others, right? And there's the whole debate of how humanities are being cut right now, and there's this,
Yep.
CS and STEM is becoming more driven, possibly because you have an empire that wants to really beat another emerging empire with developing AI first and making sure that maybe they don't
Yeah.
get the resources also to develop certain technologies. But if you could like maybe talk about specifically this thing that you call epidemiologics, right? the way that that is a
Mhm.
science, but it differs from our normal conceptions of science, and how it fits into this definition of your kind of, which you presented us as a post-normal science versus a normal science.
Um, always with the big hard questions that when the time is running out. Um, no, it's a great, it's a great question, and I guess I'll at least start, and I'm sure I won't get to finish, but I think this was uh, why I taught about those feminist philosophers and feminist scientists and feminist scientist philosophers, right? Um, who, right? And this wasn't, in some ways, this was always the uh, one way of defining what was scientific about science was not so much the status of the knowledge that it had and the certainty of it, but the scientific method, the process by which it got to that. And that's what you should always be focusing on when we're thinking about what is science and how does it work best, and all of those questions. So I think the feminists, in one way, just kind of re-emphasized what was there, which is that it's about process and about how we collectively work and think together with all of our limited resources and limited languages and limited funding um, to, kind of, I don't want to be too sort of blasé about it, but like, I just lost it now. Uh, to, it's just we're just working it. We're just doing our best, right, and trying to do it a little bit better, right. And when you focus on process, that focuses then on, it's like, well, who is it that's actually doing that process? And then you realize, oh, well, it's largely white men. Perhaps that's consequential for what how they think and what they think is important and what they think counts as a strong answer, or as a good question. And so maybe, right, if we are really so committed to process, we should diversify the kinds of people who are engaged in that process, right? And that does, and we know it to have a profound effect. And so this is great, and great for the end, because it allows me to get back to the competition thing, which I had always been meaning to say too, in that kind of the contradictory interpretations of Darwin as both pro empire and anti empire, and how that depended, both of them, on the idea that nature, and human nature in particular, is fundamentally competitive, and that's just, the struggle for resources, blah blah blah, right? But now, right, and this is uh, almost like geometrically provable. You can say that when women come into the field of primatology, and therefore evolutionary theory, in the 1970s, as a result of kind of first wave feminism, right, they start noticing different things. One, they start looking at different species. So instead of being so focused on chimpanzees and gorillas, which have very particular behavioral patterns, let's focus on lemurs and langurs and all of these other primates, to which we are related. And that was the really radical core of Darwin, which is that, yeah, this is all there is.
Mm.
Right? and we all got this. And all of those other creatures, that's all they got too. But by looking at different species of primates, and by looking at different things that they're doing. So instead of let's watch them fight, it's like let's watch them what they do with their young and their infants. And look, the biological mother is just handing off her infant to this, what is called the allo mother. And actually, look, they're totally dependent, not on competition with that other tribe of lemurs or langurs, but on the cooperation and collaboration and goodwill that exists among them. And so now we're headed. I'm confident, and I would put money on this if there were a betting pool that actually held one. That's like evolutionary theory is coming to be organized more around collaboration than around competition. And the science of it, or what science says about human nature, has changed, or is in the process of changing, or is really about to fully tip over into it's not it's at least as much human nature to be collaborative as it is to be competitive. And those are two evolutionary forces that have to be kind of thought together at the very least. And it's I think the actual even better and stronger argument is that the collaboration is more important, because if you it if you're competing with your infant, something's wrong.
Yeah.
You're not doing it right.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it there. How's that for a place to stop?
No, that's a great place to stop. I just two small points to tie that off. Like I do remember that within Darwin's Descent of Man, he actually did write a lot about how a integral part of the human, evolution and why we're so successful is because of cooperation, even though the book was filled with sexism and things like that. But and so that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But that would be all in like thank you so much for spending this time with me. And like if you have any ending comments, you can go ahead. But I found that finale of
Yeah,
kind of a
yeah.
call to action almost of cooperation to be perfect.
Yeah, that's good. No, I'm happy to leave it there. It was fun. I'd be happy to. I have a lot more stories, so I could come back anytime. But it's been great. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, I feel like we've only like scratched the little surface of this domain. So thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you, Anthony.